Resuming debate, the honourable member for Scarborough Agincourt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to join this particular debate on government motion number 2. And I do want to follow from you, Mr. Speaker, your recommendation to all members that we take the tone of the debate down a bit, and that this is in fact a serious issue that needs to be contemplated by the House, and that, frankly, and I apply this to all members on all sides of the House, that when we are dealing with issues fundamentally about sending our men and women into combat, that we give it the seriousness that it deserves, and that we don't engage in an excessive amount of rhetorical flourishes, but to debate the fundamental issues that are before us. And it gets me to, I think, some of the comments that I've heard from all sides of the House, and I want to use the time that I've been given to contribute to this particular debate, to look at the principles that had been enunciated by our leader, now the Prime Minister, when we were debating originally the decision on whether Canada should commit military resources in the fight against ISIL, against the Daesh. And also to look specifically at the details of the elements of the government's motion before the House, namely the 5 elements of the things that we are attempting to accomplish. And I go back to the comments that my friend from Durham, and to be fair, I think clearly enunciated which were the fundamental principles that guided the decision of the Liberal Party, now, of course, of the government, in terms of whether we would support the motion that had been presented back in October of 2014. The 4 principles that guided us in terms of how we decided not to support the government of the day's mission at that time to send 6 CF-18s into combat was these basic 4 principles. First of all, did Canada have a role to play? Secondly, was there a clear and defined mission? Third, would there be a clear debate? And fourth, was this the best use of Canada's resources? And on those particular elements, we felt that, at least on some of them, that the principles, that on these principles, that the government of the day did not fully make the case. With respect to the first issue, with respect to a role to play, I think that was fairly clear. The government had set out that it would be providing a contribution to the proposed air campaign from the coalition, and that we would be providing military trainers on the ground. It's the second element, I think, that became a little bit more difficult for us at that particular time, which was the nature of whether there was a clear mission. And one of the things that we were struggling with, frankly, as a caucus, was whether there was a defined endpoint. What were the actual objectives of the mission? Now, they would say the obvious objectives of the mission is to stop and degrade the advancement of ISIL in claiming territory throughout Iraq and Syria. But from our perspective, what was not clear at the time was there a specific endpoint to the particular proposed mission that had been advanced by the government. Third, the issue was a debate. And to be fair, I want to, again, and I'm going to deviate a little bit, express my appreciation to the government at the time for giving parliamentarians the opportunity to debate this matter, and this is why we have done the same today. But there has been a suggestion from the other side that the decision made by the Minister of Defence and by the Executive Council was somehow demeaning Parliament, or that we, by making the decision to end the military mission a few days ago with respect to withdrawing the 6 CF-18s, that somehow that this was actually making this resolution that we were essentially debasing Parliament. And I would object to that simply from the point of view that I would note that with respect to both debates, it is important that parliamentarians express their views, but at the end of the day, it is ultimately an executive decision, a decision that needs to be made with respect to whether we go into war or to participate in this type of activity, one that is ultimately made by the political executive. And then fourth, and I think this is the element in terms of principles that I think primarily drive the conversation, is this in fact the best way in which Canada could contribute to ultimately degrading and stopping this threat of ISIL, of the Daesh? It is on this point that we felt, and this is the primary reason why we took the position that we could not support the government of the day's motion back in October of 2014, that we did not feel that the contribution of 6 CF-18s, that the case had not been made, that contribution was appropriate, and that there were better resources that Canada could ultimately put into the field as part of our contribution to our coalition partners. And this drives me to the 5 elements that form the basis of the government motion that is before the House today. And that is of course, the 5 points being, first, of course, refocusing the mission. Canada is not withdrawing from the fight. Canada is simply redeploying its forces. And this is part of, I think, the natural evolution of all situations where there is engagements in theater, that different coalition partners will change the nature of the assets that they will put into a particular field of endeavor. The second, of course, we argued that we wanted to make more significant contributions to improve the living conditions of the affected populations, namely that in Syria and Iraq. And so that's why we have made significant ongoing contributions, additional contributions to support that particular region. Third, the third element was namely about ensuring that we invest in humanitarian assistance. And again, Canada is stepping up in terms of making sure that it provides the necessary supports to those that have been displaced by this very unfortunate situation that is taking place in that part of the world. Fourth, the fourth element that we were advancing was the importance of actually engaging the political leadership and putting more diplomatic resources into the region. And I'm going to want to talk about that particular element a little bit more in a moment. And then 5, of course, which was, I think, Canada's very generous response in welcoming 25,000 Syrian refugees that have been displaced by the conflict. I want to get back to the fourth point, and namely that, and I want to get to a broader discussion of the issue of risk and of Canada's approach in foreign affairs broadly. And I want to use this debate to sort of frame that issue, which I think is a really important one that we need to put on the floor of the House of Commons. And namely, and if I had any fundamental or ideological opposition with the former government, with now the official opposition's approach in foreign affairs, was that they were often, that they had a very, I would agree, clear ideological view of the world. And that ideological view of the world, in my view, meant that they made certain policy choices that in my view, actually reduces or actually increases risk globally. Let me give you some specific examples. And I had started to try to highlight that in some of the questions and answers that, for example, I had asked the Parliamentary Secretary for International Development. One of the things that I have had significant concern with for a long period of time is the decision by the previous government, for example, to fold CETA into the Department of Foreign Affairs and to essentially reduce our foreign policy engagements around the world. And from my perspective, I think that's actually a fundamental mistake. And I think it's a fundamental mistake to not make strategic investments into areas of the world that ultimately may become future hotspots, future areas of political conflict. And yet I contrast that to some of the decisions made by previous governments, conservative and liberal, where they have made those strategic investments, and I think that they have ultimately paid long-term dividends to Canada, as well as ultimately improving stability around the world. I'll give you some examples. For example, I think, and I had the privilege of traveling in late 2014 with the member for Calgary Nose Hill, with our Governor General, down to Chile and Colombia, with our Governor General. And on that trip, one of the things I noted was that Canada had made early investments, particularly in Chile, as well as in places like Colombia, and had invested heavily in terms of assistance, particularly in the Chilean case, some over 20 years ago, during the transitional period away from the dictatorship of General Pinochet. And those long-term investments that we made on the ground in terms of providing humanitarian assistance, dealing with adjustments in terms of the transformation of their economic conditions, and dealing with the ultimate reconciliation that took place within Chilean society, ultimately paid significant dividends for Canada, because now we are one of the significant investors in that particular region. But more importantly, I think we have gradually been able to infuse the values that I think all of us in this House ultimately espouse to, which are the liberal democratic values that drive all of us in terms of trying to promote that around the world. And I think back, and I use that as an example, and I look at the situation, for example, where the previous government made a decision by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honourable John Baird, who had engaged in, for example, Canada's decision to participate in the coalition to throw out Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And I raise that particular instance because I think one of the things that we have failed to do is recognize that it's one thing to displace governments that we ultimately don't agree with, but we ultimately need to think very carefully about what are the consequences of those types of actions. And that was one where I felt Canada acted far too hastily. And as a result now, we now have another failed state. So the question we ultimately, I think, need to consider as we are dealing with the motion before us is more broadly to think about what are the kinds of engagements that we need to do as not just as a government, but as Canadians writ large, in terms of making sure that we don't get in other situations that we see now in Syria and Iraq. Well, how do we get down to the root causes of actually allowing that kind of situation to arise? And I think of many other places around the world that there are already those conditions that are starting to brew. And that's where I had a significant, I think, fundamental objection with the previous government in terms of its choice of investments or its choice of its actions in terms of withdrawing from certain parts of the world. And that will ultimately, I think, not only erode, well, let's say, let me rephrase it, in terms of will be less able to have influence in those particular areas, but in the long run will actually contribute to greater instability that could lead to the situation that we now find ourselves in Syria and Iraq. So it's really important, I think, from my perspective, that we have a clear sense of where we want to go. And that's why this motion, from my perspective, and why I ultimately support it, is because it is it recognizes that it is not a simple black and white issue. It is not a simple function of, we're going to bomb them to stop them. Yes, we will contribute and do so in terms of participating as part of the coalition, providing our strategic assets. We've decided in this particular case to provide those strategic assets in terms of providing additional military trainers, that we will continue to leave our surveillance aircraft in field. We will continue to leave our refueling aircraft in field. So we will continue to make an important contribution. But what matters to me and why it ultimately is something that I feel that we need to ultimately think carefully about is to make sure that we have a wide, broad sectored approach that deals with the fundamental root causes that lead to the kind of instability. And we need to also think about how we ultimately place ourselves in the post-conflict environment. By working hard together within all of our coalition partners, it is our ultimate hope and aim that we will ultimately defeat this particular entity, the Daesh, ISIL. But what is important, I think, is also to think through the post-conflict scenarios and how we as Canadians within an increasingly multipolar world where there are different players in the mix, that we have the capacity to influence the decisions and actions of those great powers. We have to keep in mind, we have to be mindful, okay, of ultimately what role that Canada can ultimately play. We are, admittedly, a small middle power, and so there are limited resources that we can put in field. And I recognize my friends on the other side have argued that the air contribution that we had made is significant given our relative size. We're not arguing against it. We're not arguing against the important contribution that our Canadian Air Force has made to date. They have been part of that particular contribution. But from my particular perspective, okay, it has to be ultimately us having a clear sense of what the ultimate end game is. And that is why I think the decision that the government is making in terms of refocusing, rebalancing our particular mission, putting different assets into theater is important, because we ultimately want to have not only an important role now and today with our coalition partners, we also need to have a role in the future, okay, in terms of influencing the kind of post-conflict scenario that will be facing this particular region. And that's why we have a multifaceted approach, one that adopts a series of steps that both involves investments on the ground, taking refugees, but also diplomatic and humanitarian actions on the ground and in the broader region, in terms of trying to make sure that we will have a continuing influence in that post-conflict era. Mr. Speaker, I know that my time is coming short, so I will simply wrap up my comments by saying that the motion before the House today is an important one. And again, I would go back to the beginning of my comments at the beginning of my speech to urge all members to adopt a more civil tone in debating important issues of sending our men and women into combat or into an area of the world where there is significant risk. There will continue to be significant risk, despite the fact that we've now rebalanced this particular mission today. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us to recognize that and to recognize that this situation will continue. And as a result, I would urge members to be mindful of that, regardless of how strongly they may feel about the government's position here today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.